Hi, Tony from all the remote things, and today I've got Maxim Wheatley with me. How are you today?
Doing excellent, Tony. Thanks so much for having me here.
Oh, brilliant. Look, I've been really excited to get you on, and we were just chatting before the session how excited we both were to do this. Maxim, I think it'd be really good if you introduce yourself to everyone because, it'd be great for them to have a little bit of background before we launch into the actual interview.
Absolutely. Yeah. So in my day-to-day, I'm really the head of all things, but the head of product for Remote Rated, a really exciting website that helps people discover the best and worst remote companies. I'm also the head of business and marketing at a company called Merico, which is an international tech startup helping developers to extract interesting insights from their code and from their development processes. I'm based here in sunny Los Angeles, California. But on my day-to-day basis, I'm working with everybody across the world, including with you, of course, Tony, in good old Australia. And then, of course, folks in China, Brazil, France, England, Brazil, I just said, Canada. So my life is very much built around this remote lifestyle that we're both so excited about.
Yeah, it's fantastic. It's truly what we call location agnostic, isn't it, really? So it doesn't matter where anybody is. And I find with all the remote things, sometimes I have to pinch myself. I'm talking to someone in Los Angeles. Last night I was talking to someone in Norway. So, the great divide is gone, and digitality provides us with this fantastic ability to communicate with people. You mentioned in your preamble there about remote rated. So we're going to start with that because that's probably what people will know you for or will be most interested. Now, remote rated, your tag is that you are the glass door for remote organizations or remote work. So talk to me a little bit about what remote rated is and how it came about.
For sure. Yeah, so remoterated.com is something I'm very proud of and really excited to be sharing. And its origin story is actually quite interesting and certainly probably the definition of organic development. So way back, it seems like way back at least, right? Time has flown over the last few years. Rewind back to early 2020, the pandemic had really started kicking off. Companies all over the world, certainly in America, right, are starting to figure out, do we go remote? Do we not? Are we hybrid? Are we not? What does all of this mean? And I found this really interesting and I was enjoying tracking it. So I actually started this really silly little website that's still up today, and it's called arethayremoteyet.com. And it was literally just this, live at the time at least, updated list of who's gone remote and linking the press release or linking, the jobs page or whatever it was, right? So Twitter made their big famous announcement that all of a sudden we're totally remote. They go up on the website. Zillow says the same thing. Facebook comes out and says, hey, we're going to be remote for the rest of 2020. And I was tracking all of these things. And what I found, which was really cool to see, was how excited others were to just see this information. And it got me thinking a bit more deeply about this. I was like, okay, people are clearly eager to find who these remote companies are. They're struggling to figure out who's doing what. And there isn't really a good source of truth, certainly a good source of useful truth on this topic. So I decided to kind of go to the drawing board and think about, well, how can I expand upon this value? How can I create a resource for the community that's going to go deeper than just, sharing the names? And what really started to stand out to me even early back then, right, is there was a big gap between who's doing this well, who's doing it badly, and what kind of configurations they have. And every conversation I had with anybody, right, from a soon-to-be graduate of university trying to find their first job to some of the most senior executives that I know, all of them had so many questions about, what are the benefits? What does remote actually mean for this company? Do they do a good job of it? What are the policies? Like, what kind of perks do I have? And in all of that feedback, I realized there was this big gap in the information that I felt that we could fill with what ultimately became Remote Rated. So I decided to, build this thing that exists today, which is really this kind of user-submitted information, that gathers who are all of these remote or hybrid companies. Are they true remote? Are they partially remote? Are they hybrid? Are they not remote at all? And what's the story behind that? What are the policies? What are the perks? And perhaps most importantly, do we like working here? And if so, why so? And if not, why not? So that was the birth of Remote Rated. It really truly came about from a quick half-hour hackathon in my living room to track the remote companies and expanded into, a thing all to itself.
Yeah, it's interesting because we had a very close evolution around the same time for all the for remote AF. Obviously, our premise of making remote work well. Yours looking at remote work and is it working well? So that's how we sort of came across each other as well, which was fantastic. And a friend of ours, Alan, introduced us, so that was brilliant. Interestingly enough, you have a lot of insights that I think people would be really interested in, Maxim. So we're not going to ask you to name and shame because that's not the way of the world. But what would be interesting? What are some of the not so great things that you're seeing in this remote and hybrid that we really need to start looking at?
Absolutely, I think it's a great question, and certainly between the information that comes into the website, most of which we're publishing, right? Some of which is hidden behind the scenes as we figure out how to make good use of it and how to effectively publish it. And then certainly in all the conversations I have as part of this Remote Rated journey, interviewing people of all types, right? There are a few things that really come to mind. And I think to start at the kind of highest and most abstract level, I think success or failure boils down to really two things, to like wrap it in a neat framework. I'd say it's like the two C's. The two C's being communication and conviction. And what I mean by that is the companies that we're seeing really succeed. And I would define success as being able to attract the best talent, being able to retain the best talent, being able to grow their brand, being able to grow their company, their revenue, their customers. These companies are all excelling in communicating what their remote status is, even if they're hybrid, right? Being very clear about what that looks like. And they're high conviction in the sense that they aren't wishy-washy about what they're doing. I can point to so many bad examples, companies that have incredibly bad employee attrition, people quitting all the time, employees coming and leaving after 1 month. And one of the common features is that these are hybrid companies that keep going back and forth on what that actually means. 1 month it's 3 days a week in the office. Next month it's 1 day a week. Sometimes it's regimented which day it should be. And it's that lack of conviction that really seems to be the recipe for disaster. And I could not possibly overstate how important that is to founders, executives, companies big and small, right? Having great communication and high conviction on what exactly your policies look like and what they mean in practice is one of the most important ingredients to success in building a remote enterprise. So I'd say that's where I'd begin at the highest level, and happy to kind of drill down with you into kind of increasingly specific, kind of tactical parts of this.
Yeah. I was going to say, let me pick you up a little bit on that. So communication and conviction, which rings home really true to me. But let's drill down a little bit on the communication piece, because conviction we'll grab in a minute. But communication seems to me to be the one I see a lot about how moving into this remote or hybrid frame. It's not just communication at the top level, but it's how you communicate your intent and the way of working and how people understand, and even just that very factor of not trying to redo all the physical meetings that you did before. Now you're moving into this digital environment. How do you do that? So chat to me a little bit about what you're seeing there.
Yeah. So I think it's a great point you bring up, Tony, which is, and the way I would interpret that ultimately, and the way I think about that, is being defined and regimented about communication, right? Something that we certainly see at Remote Rated that is a common feature across all the most highly rated companies, certainly across the ones that seem to be succeeding the most wildly in terms of all the measures that we just discussed. They do have this one thing in common, which is they are being clear in how they're defining their communication frameworks. So they're putting together really explicit structure where it's saying meetings of this kind are happening through video conference or over phone call, and you'll have video on for these types of meetings, video optional for these, no video for these. If you're doing kind of one-to-one communications, you're doing it this way. If you're doing kind of group to group or one-to-many communications, maybe you're using Slack for certain types of messages. You're using email for other types. Something that I really love to talk about is, one of the companies, I struggle to remember their name at the top of my head, but if it comes to me, I'll certainly share that name. But one company that I found doing this to the greatest extent that I've seen, and certainly the most impactful, went so far as to have all of their employees create kind of what they determined was a personal README page. So, in the world, right, of products or software, many products have a README which describes like the instruction manual, right? And in that kind of personal README, they had people define for themselves as well, like, hey, Tony, if you want to chat with me, I'm actually kind of an introvert. So if you'd, call me instead of video chat me, I really prefer that. Or hey, I'm someone that really does kind of find a lot of value in making that virtual eye contact. So I'm so excited to do a Zoom, and let's do that. I think kind of really empowering people, empowering the company is certainly almost an essential to define those communication frameworks. But I think drilling all the way down to the personal level to not let anything be an accident is really how I would ultimately capture that, right? Is when you let those communication channels become kind of accidental, or not deliberate or not defined, you get this mix and match of, certain things get communicated in a public Slack channel, and then, maybe everyone sees it and they get annoyed about it and it creates static. Or maybe if someone is bad at doing the opposite, they're sharing it one-to-one, and then next thing you know, you're in a meeting where only two people have context, and that creates issues too. And I think all of that boils down, right, to just this kind of seemingly simple but highly impactful piece, which is having that manual for the company of here's how we communicate, here's the channels we use, for which contexts, for which purposes. And then I think if you can go a step further, especially if you're a larger organization, to let the employees also have some say in that, as far as kind of what their one-to-one interactions might look like. I think that helps you to kind of get everything aligned and make everyone comfortable. And when communication flows, everything else comes nicely after it.
I couldn't agree more. And slightly gratuitous plug, but we obviously have a lot of similarities in the way we think around that. And with Remote AF, we talk about that a lot in terms of our team launch canvas. For anybody who's watching this, you can check that out on remoteaf.co. The team launch canvas delves into, if you're going to launch and you're going to do this, even if you've been doing this for a while, and you want to think about many of those things that you've just spoken about. The other thing that we talk about is a story.me canvas, which is literally what you're talking about, a read me, my story, how am I at home, how am I work, how do I prefer, what are the, and I think those are tools that can help as well. So I totally agree with you. I think digging a little deeper into that links itself into conviction though, right? So your second C. So I'm interested to delve into that a little bit, because it's not just, it's conviction about hybrid and remote and what we're going to do with that. But then once you do that, there's a conviction to how you're going to actually do that and stick to that way of working as well. Exactly. And then how you're going to evolve that to make sure it works for your employees. What are you seeing with that stuff?
Yeah, I think to get really tactical and really actionable, right? One thing that I would say speaks to the conviction piece, right, is especially for companies that are resourced enough to afford to do so, I think having benefits and policies that are specific to the lives of remote workers goes a tremendously long way. Not just in establishing conviction, right, to being able to say, hey, we are committed to remote work, we're committed to being great at remote. Goes a long way there. It goes a long way to attract great people. Goes a long way to retain those great people. And some of the benefits that I would talk about that I think resonate in a massive way and have an ROI that is substantial in terms of dollars spent to impact, are things like basics, right? Like internet stipends or internet reimbursement. Same with mobile and phone reimbursement. I think being able to put together a really great onboarding process that includes things like a home desk setup, companies that are dedicating an allowance to that, giving people the flexibility to say, you know what, like I have a great monitor, have a great desk, but maybe it would be great if I could buy myself this slick $500 chair so I'm really, comfortable. I think that's another thing that I would say is a common ingredient in the best companies that we're seeing is they have a very clear and robust set, of kind of onboarding oriented perks and policies and benefits that really speak to that conviction piece. And I think buried in all of this too, if we kind of look at what's another connecting thread here too, it's also acknowledging that everyone's different, right? The README, it's acknowledging that everyone's different and their flavor of this might vary a little bit. Same with things like, the home desk setup, right? It's recognizing that you're going to treat people like adults, you're going to value them, you're going to commit to, the remote work setup and give them the power, where it's appropriate to dictate what that looks and feels like to them.
Yeah, I agree, because the ones we're seeing that are doing that well have certainly gone there. And we talk a lot about that within Remote AF around the sustainability factor there. You can't shift the big organizations. Take note if you're listening to this, right? There is an onus on you now not to shift the dollar to your people's bottom line. That you're moving them into remote, and there's a value benefit to you because, obviously you don't have to have as much real estate. You've got a lot of things there. So you've got to think about how you're going to deal with that as well. So totally agree. And I think the ones we're seeing that have done that well are really reaping the benefits of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, if I was speaking directly to executives about this kind of thing too, which sometimes I am, right? The point I would make here is you're going to find no higher ROI in any of your talent related decisions than this kind of stuff, right? Where I have seen so many companies trip over themselves to put together kind of $2,000 or $3,000 worth of kind of onboarding, focused benefits for people, and you have to look them in the eyes and you go, you're talking about people that are making at least 150,000 and up. And so you're talking about what, 2%, if not less, of the total expected annual cost of this employee, and you're not willing to invest this to greatly accelerate that, greatly enable them, to buy a little bit of extra loyalty, a bit of extra goodwill, a bit of extra productivity. I think it's crazy to people like you and I, right? Because we think about this all the time, but certainly I think this is the conversation that needs to be had, is figuring out, where are these high ROI things that relate specifically to high conviction, high commitment, remote configuration, and helping them to see that that's going to pay massive dividends very quickly.
Yeah, and I think when you talk about, we're all hearing about the Great Resignation, right? The Great Resignation is not just around the fact that people want to work remote, they don't want to go in. Yes, we know that that's part of it. Again, if you're an executive listening, we know that is the case because we're hearing that quite prodigiously across the world. But it is that working situation, right? I think there's a thing there that they're not seeing, is that if you're not enabling your people to work in the best possible way, then they're looking at it and going, well, there's a company over here that's doing that, and I can work remote.
Yeah,
that's what I'm going to do. And I can see that as we accelerate this remote/hybrid, it's not going away. So people are going to be looking for those types of jobs.
Exactly. No, I think it's a great point you bring up. And, something it reminds me of is this kind of funny paradox that I feel a lot of executives aren't seeing, right? Where we talk a lot about how exciting it is as a company to have, in theory, right, access to a global talent pool. That to us is exciting. It gives us this great capability to go recruit from anywhere. But I think what a lot of executives are perhaps forgetting is that's a double-edged sword. It now means your people have the global pool of companies to look at rather than what's just in their back garden. And I think that's a big part of why we're seeing this kind of, global phenomena of this Great Resignation, right? Is all of a sudden people are so much less limited in terms of what kinds of companies can they look at, what kinds of, lifestyles can they lead? I think it's this kind of like plucking away of all these limiting factors that we're now seeing. And I think, the truly great companies are without question recognizing that the onus has never been higher to compete to keep your people because of these factors. And that if you're going to disregard those and be stubborn and pretend they don't exist, well, perhaps you'll be fine for a couple of months or maybe a couple of years, but surely, I think those companies will find themselves years from now realizing that was the turning point for their downfall.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's a story that I heard recently. So the double-edged sword is the word you use, which is quite right. So there's a HR connotation to this, right? The human method in that as well is thinking that, you know, people are working from home now, and if their workstations and things aren't set up properly, then you're going to have some real work health, place, and safety issues. So that onus comes back to the employer. Now, the double-edged sort of that, some of the employer reaction to that is, well, we'll just make them come back to work, right? Because we can control that. However, that's the reality of that. That's what starts to factor into the, well, sorry, I'm not doing that anymore. Like I take myself, I regularly say on here, you know, I live on an island, you know, I don't want to go back into the physical setup of working in an office. So, you know, I'm happy where I am, and I'm lucky I have a job that affords me to do so. But a lot of people are looking at it now going, well, I'm not going to do that again. I don't want 3 hours of commute.
Exactly. No, just very recently, maybe even yesterday, the New York Times put out this great piece that really boiled down to a very funny realization, which I agreed on, you know, which is maybe we've all forgotten how much the office sucks, basically. Like, it's made us realize, you know, people are realizing, right? Like they've been away from it, maybe look at it with rose-colored glasses, you know, of like, oh, remember when, you know, Tony and I would play, you know, a game of ping pong, and then we'd get, you know, all free pizza and free coffee, and how great was that? And it's way better than my living room. You know, but I think what people are now finding is they're going back, if they are being forced to, where they're suddenly realizing, like, you know what, like, not quite as good as I remember, especially now I compare it to this new life that I've been forced to live. And I use that word really kind of pointedly, you know, forced to live. Because I think, you know, if I look at, you know, I'm going all the way back to like the failures in communication, right? When I look at executive level, corporate level communication, success or failure, you know, I think you can see all kinds of companies that have stumbled badly in their corporate communication failures, where they have failed to acknowledge just how much their people have been through in adapting to this, right? Like, you can see that all these, you know, legions of people who, through thick and thin, with toddlers in their living room, with really bad home office setups initially, have found ways to make it work. They've found ways to be productive. They've found ways to be reliable. They've found ways to make it work, and they've gradually adapted. And I think it's such a slap in the face to your talent, you know, if you're coming back to them and saying, hey, vacation's over, you know, now you have to come back and, you know, go back to normal, because normal is the only way we succeed. You know, I think those failures in communication, either implicitly or explicitly, are basically saying, hey, all these adaptations, meaningless. All the sacrifices you've made, meaningless. We're not more productive, we're less, even if, you know, that's in many cases not the case. So it's another really big communication issue.
Yeah, I agree. Maxim, I might just take a little sort of left turn here, because I think it's interesting, because, you know, we've talked about remote rated, and we've talked about how that came about. But, you know, people are sort of sitting and go, well, who's this guy? You know, who's he to be commenting on remote work? Right. And I think it's interesting for people to know that this just, you know, you didn't just suddenly start remote work today. So let's talk about it. You know, you started out in an early role with remote. Do you want to talk about that a little bit, and then sort of take us through where you are now?
For sure. Yeah. So I've had the good fortune to work in a variety of types of companies, from very early stage startups, right, including my own. I'm a founder myself. To being an executive leader at a 60,000 person company. I'll skip through most of that and talk about really kind of where my personal remote journey begins, right? So I applied for this job somewhat randomly. Seemed interesting, and at the time I wasn't specifically hunting for remote versus not remote. This must have been 2015, 2016-ish. Turned out, once, you know, I was neck deep in the interview process, that this was really kind of a primarily remote company. And I'll kind of describe a bit more about how it works and the lessons learned along the way. But one way or another, you know, found myself at first as an individual contributor, you know, working with a vice president of this big company in a remote capacity. Ended up succeeding very strongly in my role and got promoted to lead a team all across North America. I had 22 people reporting to me, of course, all distributed, all remote. And really, you know, being kind of given that promotion, without much kind of training or background, right, in how to lead or run a remote company or remote team, had to learn the lessons the hard way. So I certainly kind of had to figure out all of these things for myself of, how do you build effective collaboration frameworks? Like, how do you onboard people? How do you interview people? How do you build culture and rapport? All of these challenges, right, I had to navigate. And I'll say maybe it could be something interesting for us to touch upon, Tony, that was a very valuable experience at this company. So I'm happy to name the company, and have no hard feelings towards them whatsoever. But it's an international outsourcing company called T-Tech, 60,000 people around the world. And what in hindsight was very interesting about my education there is they were the classic kind of misconfigured company from a remote perspective, in the sense that they were hybrid, but with this very kind of two-class system, right? Where they had this very glamorous big headquarters in Colorado where most of the most executives were. And naturally they're collaborating in person. And then you have this kind of second ring of less senior executives who are in the field working remotely. Then you have all of the people supporting them, most of whom are remote. And in hindsight, one of the most valuable lessons that I took from that was, at least in that hybrid arrangement, if you weren't finding ways to reliably interface with that in-person cohort, if you weren't finding ways to get yourself in those meetings, if you weren't finding ways to build rapport with that, you really did kind of become a second-class citizen, not in the sense that you were being treated badly, but in the sense that you were, a couple steps behind people in terms of information flow. Maybe you don't get the pick of the litter when it comes to projects or accounts or input on decisions. So, I took from that, this kind of really valuable lesson for myself, which is, something many companies are finding out for themselves now, which is perhaps the only thing worse than, a non-remote organization is a organization that thinks it's remote but isn't really, and kind of has exactly, and has this kind of, these kind of two different, completely separate lanes of collaboration and communication.
Yes, so you've really got to design. That's what we talk to organizations all the time, Maxim. I think this is where you're going, is that if you're going to be remote or hybrid, although I'm quite hard on people about hybrid, because the minute you have somebody who's not in the room, you're all remote, right?
Exactly.
Right? So let's be honest about it. So you have to design for that context, right? And if you're not doing that, then you get caught between the two worlds, and we see those things that you're talking about. But that sort of spanned further for you. You then went to a company called Merico, which is, I think you said to me, I'll own up to reading here, you went from about 5 employees right through to, about 100 today, and some of those lessons you built into there. Talk to me about that a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So another kind of really fun, almost by accident story, right? Where when I joined the company, it was 5 people, as you mentioned, and an interesting setup where 2 of the co-founders, both of them are Chinese nationals. One is based here in California, and one was ultimately based in Beijing. And by virtue of that, we kind of came straight out of the gates with this kind of hybrid remote setup, right, where we're just figuring out how to collaborate as a small team. And then we really started growing in the midst of the pandemic, and then had to really make up our minds as to what kind of company we wanted to be. And, had this kind of very clear realization where we're like, well, we've been accidentally remote really from day one. So why don't we really double down on this and commit to it, and build ourselves in that way? So it's been a really great learning experience to figure out, all parts of that puzzle, right? Figuring out how we structure onboarding, how we get people up to speed on tricky technical products, which is ultimately what we make and sell. How do you collaborate and communicate effectively across not just time zones, but across languages? And it's something that I really enjoy kind of showing off to friends and family. And it's a shout out to one of the products we use. Is this, kind of Chinese analog of Slack. It's called Lark, or in Chinese, Feishu. And it's built by ByteDance, who are the makers of TikTok, among many other softwares. But what makes this, app unbelievably powerful, Lark and Feishu, is it's got all of this live translation capability built right into it. So what makes it unbelievably magic is on a day-to-day basis, I'll have these seamless technical collaborations with some of our engineers in Beijing, some of our collaborators in France or India. And in some of those cases, there's no shared language, right? They don't speak English. Certainly don't speak very good Mandarin. But we're able to have these incredible collaborations by virtue, of the translation software. So basically,
what a fantastic thing. That's brilliant.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I'll definitely get you to give me the link to that so I can share that with our audience as well. So that will be we'll put that in the show notes for sure. So that'll be great, and we'll share it with our remote AF community as well. We're very close to the end of our time. So there's one thing I just wanted to say or ask you is we've talked about the length and breadth of this. If I was to ask you for your 3 top real actionable things for companies to do, what would they be?
It's a great question. So I think one of the first things I'd say is create a coherent internal knowledge base. And what I mean by that is realizing that all of this kind of context-based kind of osmosis learning that may have happened in person in your previous experiences, it's not going to happen in a remote setting. And that doesn't mean you just hand someone this endless book of, badly written pages, right? Doesn't mean you point them to an internal wiki, and make them read for 16 hours straight. I think the successful companies for sure are figuring out, smart ways that work for them to really get people up to speed with not just, the traditional onboarding stuff, right? Of like, here's our products, here's our market, here's the org chart. I think the actionable piece of feedback I'd give to layer onto all of that is the how and the why behind all of those things is absolutely critical. So don't just explain to them, here's our market, or here's our products. Think about what are the important kind of subtle kind of context or osmosis learning type things that you might have picked up otherwise, but are going to struggle to do automatically in this context. So being able to explain, why is our product this way? Like, what are the decisions? What's the feedback that has kind of gone into why things are the way they are, things we've said no to, and the rationale behind that? I think really finding effective ways to get people up to speed on that kind of thing, really, really, really critical. The other piece of actionable advice I'd give to certainly remote leaders is understanding that we face this interesting paradox in great remote work collaboration, which is this, that the best meetings and the best kind of points of communication, right, they happen with nicely defined structure. They come with nicely defined agendas. If you set up a meeting where there's a specific topic to cover, specific problems to chase after, specific action items and outcomes that you're seeking, that's how you do this really well. But what that automatically boxes out is it doesn't give much space for people to have kind of just organic hangouts, organic kind of get to know one another's. And that rapport is essential because it builds trust. And I think you can't have great asynchronous collaboration without trust. So I think a piece of actionable advice I would give managers for sure is, carve out time, whether it's once a week, whether it's every other week, whether it's half an hour, whether it's 2 hours, find a way that gets everyone excited and comfortable to bring them together, and create a basic enough framework around that, right? Whether it's, hey, we're going to, today we're going to talk about like what movies and TV shows we're really enjoying, or we're going to talk about like our favorite vacations. Like finding something, right, to kind of get people loose, get them talking, goes a tremendously long way in making people feel, part of something, making them feel like they have a personal connection to the people they're working with. Goes a tremendously long way. The last piece, which sounds very trivial, but I've found has been an enormously impactful thing in my personal practice as a remote leader, as well as just a remote contributor to a remote company, right, is trying to kind of bring some communications to people like you would be engaging with them in real life. And what I mean by that is I don't jump into our communication platforms, or at least I try not to, right? And I don't suddenly, first message I send to Tony is, hey Tony, like, can you send me that spreadsheet, or what's the latest on this project? I come in and I give the quick 3 minutes to say, hey Tony, good morning, how are you doing? Wait for you to respond, and I think that's an important kind of part of bringing humanity to work and bringing humanity to your communications that goes a tremendously long way, because I think otherwise it can create this very abrupt input-output kind of dialogue that makes people feel disconnected, makes them feel like they're a commodity, or makes them feel like they're just kind of a gear in the system. And I think it's really on us as leaders to find ways to not make that the case. And that's one very simple but super impactful thing that I recommend to everybody. So I would say those are kind of my 3 key pieces of advice there. When I think about things that you could apply to any company, any size, whether you've got 15 billion in the treasury or you're a startup that's figuring out how you're going to pay for coffee tomorrow, everyone can do these things, and it makes a big impact.
That's absolutely brilliant. Look, we're at the end of our time. I think everybody's going to appreciate those 3 top things that you've given us. Thank you for spending the time with us today. How can people get involved with any of the things that you've just talked about, remote rated or touch base with yourself?
Absolutely. Yeah, would love to chat with anybody, share my experiences, hear yours, find ways to feature you on our blogs, perhaps interview you for something, feature your company. Many different things we can do. I'm easy to find. Remote Rated is easy to find. So you can find Remote Rated at just www.remoterated.com. You'll find it on Twitter as just /Remote Rated. And then you can find me very easily. My name is Maxim Wheatley. I'm sure it'll be in the show notes. I'm Maxim Wheatley on LinkedIn. I'm Maxim Wheatley on Twitter. I try and stay engaged on all of those things, and look forward to hearing from people. Happy to chat, happy to answer questions, happy to get into debates if anything I said you disagree with. But nonetheless, I'm enormously passionate, as I know you are, Tony, about all of this kind of work-life freedom and work-life balance that can be introduced by this transformation that we're all being part of. No one's figured it out, but I think we're doing a better job of figuring it out and being at that leading edge. So welcome anyone that wants to come and help us do that and wants to chat about it.
Fantastic. Yes, we're all passionate about it, as you said. And I think in 10 years, when we look back and we see where we are now and where we are there, we'll be wondering how we even did it that way. So look, if you really enjoyed this today, don't forget to like, subscribe, amplify. And also don't forget, we're now Remote Agility Framework has its own community on circle.io. Please feel free to come and join us. You can join from the actual remoteaf.co website. Please join us. Maxim, again, thank you for spending some time with us today. It was a pleasure to have you on all the remote things.
Thanks for having me, Tony. It was a great time.